Hey guys, this is Paul Vecchio, and I want to go through another lighting breakdown. This is for the film The Last Deal. It's kind of a crime drama. It was directed by David Wharton Jr. It was his first film, and I was glad to jump in as a DP to help a first-time filmmaker realize his dream. So here you can see the lighting set up. Just going to go over a couple things. This one is relatively simple, but it has a really nice look. So here we have a 4x of light grid. If you don't know what grid cloth is, the characteristic of this diffusion is that it adds a little bit of yellow, and you're going to see that a little bit later on. And I kind of like that. I kind of like that yellowish look. It's good for some things, not good for everything, but in this instance, I think it contributed greatly to the look of the film. So here we have a 4x4 light grid, and I have two 2-bank 2-foot flow lights. If you don't know what flow lights are, or if you don't know what model I'm talking about, I'll put a link in the description. So we had two of those lights blasting into the 4x4 light grid cloth, and that gave us softish kind of shadows and a nice downside on this side of the face. One of the things I would have done was probably put negative fill on this side to kind of knock down this side even more, but I'll get to that a little bit later on. You'll see why. The other light on the actor is this practical light, which is about 8 feet away. It's way off camera here, and it's just a standard IKEA light that was a lamp that was actually there on set. There's also a light here in the bottom left corner here, which is not on the diagram. Again, an IKEA light that's kind of lighting this corner here, and you can see that when I jump into the wide shot. I'll show you guys that later when I jump into color correction. The only other light is this practical in the background, and we thought the look of it matched the set pretty well, so we decided to put it in the background. Just a couple notes, this light in the background was probably the first light that I set because we didn't have any light bulbs. Again, this is a low budget production, so it was one of those things where, we kind of just came into the location and figure out what we needed. We did do a location scout beforehand, which was good because we got to see the roof and the rest of the area here, which was good because then we got the plan ahead of time and then we figured out what we needed. I had a different idea to light this, but we didn't have the time or the rigging to do it, so I just ended up going with the 4x light grid and the two bank 2-foot flow lights. But because this practical here was the first light that was set, based off of that light I knew how much light I needed to put on the actor. And I just want to talk about that a little bit more. I needed the exposure on this background light to be correct. I didn't want it to be blowing out in the background because that would guide the eye to that point and it would be too distracting. So I didn't want to have that light blowing out in the background. So I set my exposure according to that light, and then I came in with the 4x light grid and decided how much light I would need on the actor's face from there. So to illustrate this a little bit better, I'm just going to draw the scene out here. So we had an actor here, and we also had another actor here, and they were at this longer table, and they were playing cards. And so the wall was back here, and then we had a 4x of light grid. That's supposed to be a 4x, just bear with me. And then we had two flow lights blasting into that, and those are 2-bank 2-foot flow lights. Of course, that's gonna fall off there, so I'm just gonna extend that out, so you'll just have to trust my drawing here that that's a 4x. So it's a 4x4 of light grid, and then in the background here we had a small IKEA light here, which was a 60-watt light, and that shot light over to the actor, and you can see it if I zoom in. You can see a small sheen, very light sheen on the side of his head, and that's what that small practical was doing. Then we had a light here on this table back here, and that was just kind of illuminating the wall and also the table in the background. And that's it. Looking back, I think I probably would have added a 4x here, not blocking this light coming in, but just adding a 4x of negative fill. And that would have brought down the exposure on the side of his face a little bit more. While it looks good here, you'll see why I would have added that negative fill when we go into color correction. So once again, just to recap, we had two 2-bank 2-foot flow lights pushing into this 4x of light grid. We had a little light in the corner here, and then we had this practical in the background, and then we had a 60-watt practical about 8 feet away, just giving the side of his face a tiny bit of sheen there. This is a very shadowy scene, so you don't need a lot of lights when you have a lot of shadows. You just have to think about the intensity of the light, the placement of the light, and where you want the shadows to fall. So I just want to go over the color correction here. Now I know this is a different actor. His name is Alex, and this is David Wharton, Sr., so father in his kid's film, which is pretty awesome. Little side note there. So I think this is a really nice looking image, and it has a very soft contrast to it, and I'll talk about that in a second. But one of the things to watch is the shadow on the side of his face here. So I'm just going to come in here and reset the grade, and let's look at this full screen. So you can see that that shadow isn't as deep in the raw footage as it is in the color corrected image. But if you look at some of these other areas, like down here, maybe over here, and over here, on the side over here, you can kind of tell that there's very deep shadows, and I should have probably done that to the side of his face, and that's why I would have added that negative fill. But in color correction, we can add that, but there is a little bit of a cost. It's not really bad at all, but there is a little bit of a side effect to doing it in post, and I'll go over that in a second. So the first thing I'm going to do is add my typical starting point. Now, if you remember, I usually do a color space transform from the Blackmagic color space into Rec 709 and linear gamma, and then I take that and convert it to Arri Alexa Arri Log C. Now the problem here is that we shot ProRes, and we shot ProRes 2K, so we don't have access to the raw controls. So there's a couple things that we can do. We can actually take the color space transform in the node, and instead of doing Rec 709 linear right away, what we can do is grab the Blackmagic 4.6K film V3, which is what we shot on. And actually, to look at some of the camera metadata, you can see here that we shot on the Blackmagic Ursa Mini 4.6K, not the Pro. I think this was actually before the Pro actually came out. And so we shot ISO 800, color temperature is 3800 Kelvin, white balance tint is 10, and we shot ProRes 444 2K. So jumping back to this color space transform, what we can do is select the Blackmagic Design 4.6K Film V3. From the input gamma drop-down menu, we can select the Blackmagic Design 4.6K Film, and then we can convert directly to Arri Alexa Arri Log C. Or if you're feeling very specific and you want to do it the way that we normally do for RAW, you can convert it to Rec 709 and then linear. So we can drop another color space transform on the next node and convert Rec 709 linear to Arri Alexa Arri Log C. And there we go. Now I'm just going to add another node here because, as you know, I use this node for relighting before the LUT, and that's just in case we need it. So now that we've converted the color space and I've got my starting point that I like, let's jump into the color correction here. Now I don't have my Davinci Resolve panel at the moment, so I'm just going to do this with the mouse, and it's actually probably better because then you get to see exactly what I'm doing. It's just going to be a little bit slower. So let me drop the shadows down to 0, and you can watch here in the scopes as they drop down to 0. So that's about right. Now let's look at the face for a second. So you can see here that the shadow on the side of his face is there, but you could still see some detail there. And I wanted that shadow to be a little bit deeper, and that's why I would have added the negative fill. So in order to get that now, I'd have to drop the midtones to get it to a point where I think looks good. And when I do that, you have to watch out because now you're clipping the blacks. So as I drop the gamma or the midtones, you can see that the shadows drop below 0. So now I'm clipping them. So if you don't want to do that, you're going to have to push the lift back up. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to set it right there, and I think that looks good. Now, if we look at the side of his face, you can see that there's less detail there and that there's more of a shadow on the side of his face, which is exactly what I want. So I'm just going to drop the midtones just a little bit more and just watch the shadows, make sure I'm not clipping. And I think that looks good. And I think the light level of this light on the wall could probably come up just a little bit. I want it to seem like this light's maybe a little bit brighter, so I can just take the gain because that's one of the brightest parts of the image, and I can push that up just a tiny bit. And that's looking pretty cool. Now, if I look at the rest of the image, it's too saturated. You could really see the yellow from the grid cloth. And as a side note, I also shot this on Leica R Summicron lenses, and those also add yellow to the image, so we just have way too much yellow here. So one of the things we could do, actually, is push a little bit of blue into the midtones, and I'm actually going to do that in a separate node. Now remember, this node here is color boost, and then this one would be my saturation. Now I just want to push a little bit of blue into it, give it a nice feel. That's a little too much, actually. I'm going to reset that and push just a tiny bit into there, and that's actually a little bit better. So what I also want to do now is drop the saturation. So I'm just going to drop the saturation here. If I before and after it, you can see that the skin tones look less yellow, but everything is looking still very warm and nice. And actually, I think I went too far with the desaturation, so I'm just going to pump it up just a little bit. That's looking pretty good. Another thing I can do is, if I feel that I took out too much warmth, I could just reset the midtones and get rid of that blue that I added. And actually, now that I'm looking at it, I think I like this better. I just feel that this scene needs to be warmer. So I'm actually going to drop a little bit more of the saturation out, and I think that's looking really good. Now this last node here, you're probably not going to be able to see it in the screen recording, but it is Film Convert, and again, 35mm Academy at 50%. I might bump this up to about 71, and I think that's looking pretty cool. I like that grain texture in there, and I think that looks really cool. So that's really it for this look. So here's another thing that I want to point out here. I'm just going to reset this grade. Now, I'm going to copy this grade that we just did. So basically what happened in this scene is that this guy came in and he sent this guy home, and now he's sitting where he's sitting, so it's moments after. Now, the problem is that his skin tone's a little bit darker, so we may not get a light level that's the same here, but that's okay because I really think that this is looking good. But if we really wanted to, we can come in with the relight and just kind of put that in here and just add a little bit more light to his face, and I think that's looking really good. So I just want to talk about contrast a little bit. If you remember before, I mentioned that there's a little bit of a disadvantage to enhancing the shadow on the side of the face in post, and let's talk about that for a second. So I just reset our levels here, and I'm just going to push the lift back down to 0, or our blacks back down to 0. Okay, and that's good. Now, if you look over here, since I reset it, I haven't touched the midtones, and you can see here that there is a little bit too much light on this side of his face. So now, in order to crush down and get rid of a lot of the detail here and make this side of his face darker, I can push the gamma down, but let's talk a little bit about contrast. The Leica R Summicrons have less contrast than some of the more popular lenses nowadays, like the Sigma Art series. So it's not so bad here, but if we wanted to maintain this softish look that we're getting, one thing to note is that if you bring the midtones down, you're actually increasing the contrast here. So it's going to make the image feel a little bit sharper. Now, if I just bring the lift back up, because we were clipping the blacks because I pushed the midtones down, when you add contrast, it does increase the apparent sharpness. So you want to watch out for that, because if you're bringing the midtones down and then you're going to compensate by bringing the gain up, suddenly everything is looking kind of poppy and sharper. So let's take a look at this. So things get a little bit more contrasty. Now, it's not so bad once you desaturate it, but they're still poppy and contrasty, and you really want to make sure that if that's not what you're going for, that you get the lighting perfect on set so that you're not adding contrast and changing the look in post-production. If that is the look you're going for, then that's fine, but you just want to make sure that you get the lighting right on set, so if you're doing a little bit of a cheat in post, you're not changing the intended look of the film. So I'm just going to go in and reset that, and I'm going to drop our blacks back down to 0, and I'm going to drop the midtones down, and I think that's pretty good. I'm going to move the highlights up just a little bit, and I think that's good enough where we're not making it too contrasty. It still has that soft look. Now keep in mind, we did shoot with a Pro Mist 1/8 on set, so it is adding even more softness and a little bit of a mist. But I think this is looking really good. So it's just something to remember, that if you don't want to add apparent sharpness or a more contrasty look in post, you really need to make sure that you get the lighting right on set, or at least very close, and then you can manipulate it a little bit in post-production without changing the intended look of the piece. So as a little bit of a bonus for staying till the end, I just want to show you some behind-the-scenes footage here. I'm just going to draw on these images that this is that practical light that I was talking about that was against the wall here. And again, this is the Ursa Mini 4.6K. This is a small HD 502 monitor in the side finder, so I use that as sort of my viewfinder. And this is a wooden camera matte box, a land part follow focus, which is pretty good for the price. It's actually really impressive. And you can see here the Leica R 35mm Summicron. And this is the table that they were at. So here's another behind the scenes shot, and you can see that over here we had to black out the window here because these were actual windows. For some reason there's brick laid over the back of these windows, but not this one. That's Manhattan for you. And then you can see here that there's a light, this light that I was talking about, and then we had the practical here on the table. And here's a better shot of the Leica Summicron 35mm. So you can see the lighting setup a lot better in this one. This is the 4x of light grid that I was talking about. This is the fluorescent flow light here that you can see here. And it's pointing, going this way, lighting him. We have the lamp in the background and that small light over here. And then for the reverse angle, all we did was take this and move it over, move this couch out of the way, and then angled this to light Mike over here. One of the things I forgot to mention was on this side of the 4x, we didn't have it set up here, but when Dave sat down, we noticed that this flow light was reflecting in the window back here. So I put a 4x floppy on this side, so you can see it better in these two photos. It's this side, this is the reverse of this. So you can see that this is the 4x. I just draped a 4x floppy to flag off the reflection of the light in the window here. Here's another shot of the camera setup. Here's Mike. We'll get to Mike's side a little bit later on because we had a little bit different of a lighting setup for him. This is Dave Wharton through the camera monitor, and you can see the settings here of ISO 800, 3800 Kelvin, white balance, tint at 10. And here's another behind the scenes shot from the camera point of view. And here's a cool shot of the camera with the city in the background. Now, actually, one thing I did want to show you, this reflective filter inside of the camera. With the Blackmagic 4.6K, and also I personally believe with the Ursa Mini, some people might tell you different with the internal NDs, because the internal NDs do block a little bit of IR pollution. But I like to use a Schneider 680 IR cut filter because I don't think that the camera blocks enough IR, even with the internal NDs on the Pro. So I always have a Schneider 680 IR cut filter in the front of my matte box, just as a side note. Now here's a wider shot of us filming. Now you can see the lights, you can see the 4x, and you can see over here in the bottom corner there's another light, and then over here you can see a little bit of that light that's on that desk. And one more just for the hell of it. But I think by now you get the point. So once again, this is Paul Vecchio. If you like this video, please subscribe, like it, and share it. We'll have more short films, filmmaking breakdowns, lighting breakdowns, color correction breakdowns, and everything, visual effects breakdowns. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching, Paul Vecchio. I'll see you guys next time. Thanks, bye.